The year is 1944, and the skies over Europe are dominated by Allied bombers. Thousands of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters rain destruction upon German cities and industrial centers daily. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, is now struggling to defend the Reich. German pilots are outnumbered, outgunned, and losing the war of attrition. But then, something extraordinary happens. A sleek, silver aircraft screams through the formation at unprecedented speed, its twin jet engines leaving conventional propeller-driven fighters in the dust. This is the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and it represents a technological leap that could have altered the entire trajectory of the air war. But here's the haunting question that has fascinated historians for decades. What if Germany had prioritized this revolutionary technology earlier? What if the Me 262 had entered service in 1942, or even 1943 instead of late 1944? Could jet fighters have given the Luftwaffe air superiority and changed the outcome of World War II itself? To understand the profound implications of this question, we need to first appreciate just how revolutionary jet propulsion was in the context of the 1940s aerial warfare. The principle of jet engines had been theorized for years, but it was German engineer Hans von Ohain and his British counterpart Frank Whittle who independently developed working prototypes in the late 1930s. The advantage was immediately apparent. Jet engines could propel aircraft to speeds that propeller-driven planes simply could not match. While the fastest piston-engine fighters of World War II, like the P-51 Mustang or the Focke-Wulf FW-190, topped out around 440 miles per hour, the Me 262 could reach the speeds of 540 miles per hour. This 100-mile-per-hour advantage meant that Me 262 pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage from combat. They could dive on Allied bomber formations, unleash devastating firepower from their four 30mm cannons, and zoom away before escort fighters could react. In the hands of experienced pilots, the Me 262 was nearly untouchable in air-to-air combat. The historical reality is that the Me 262 program suffered from numerous delays, technical challenges, and perhaps most critically strategic mismanagement. The aircraft first flew with jet engines in July 1942, but it wouldn't enter operational service until July 1944, and even then only in limited numbers. By the time Me 262s were flying combat missions in meaningful quantities, it was already too late. Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, fuel supplies were critically short, and experienced pilots were in desperately short supply. Only about 1,400 Me 262s were produced during the entire war, and of those, only a fraction ever saw combat. The jet fighter that should have been Germany's ace in the hole became instead a case study in squandered technological advantage. So, let's engage with our central question. What if things had gone differently? Imagine an alternate timeline where German leadership recognized the strategic importance of jet fighters in early 1941. In this scenario, the Me 262 program receives top priority, unlimited resources, and protection from political interference. The technical challenges that plagued the Jumo 004 jet engines are solved earlier through concentrated engineering effort and adequate testing. Instead of the historical timeline, the Me 262 enters operational service in substantial numbers by mid-1942, right as the Allied bombing campaign against Germany is beginning to intensify. What happens next? The immediate impact would be felt in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe. In 1942 and early 1943, The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces were still refining their strategic bombing doctrines. Losses were already significant, but they were deemed acceptable given the strategic goals. The introduction of Me-262s in large numbers would have dramatically altered this calculus. American daylight bombing raids, which relied on tight defensive formations and fighter escorts, would suddenly face an enemy that could strike with impunity. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that escorted the bombers in 1943 would be completely outmatched by jets that were 80 to 100 miles per hour faster. Bomber losses would skyrocket. Crews would face a new terror in the skies, an enemy they couldn't outrun, couldn't outmaneuver, and could barely even see before it struck. The psychological impact on Allied bomber crews cannot be overstated. These men were already facing tremendous odds, with many bomber groups suffering casualty rates that exceeded 50% over the course of a tour of duty. The appearance of an invincible enemy fighter would have been devastating to morale. We might have seen a situation similar to what happened in late 1943 during the Schweinfurt raids, where losses became so catastrophic that deep penetration missions into Germany had to be temporarily suspended. But in this alternate timeline, the crisis would be worse and would persist longer. The Allies would not have an immediate answer to the jet threat. Developing and deploying their own jet fighters, like the British Gloucester Meteor or the American P-80 Shooting Star, would take time, possibly until late 1944 or early 1945 in the best-case scenario. This brings us to one of the most critical questions. Could increased German jet fighter production have halted or significantly delayed the Allied strategic bombing campaign? The bombing of Germany served multiple crucial purposes for the Allies. It destroyed industrial capacity, particularly oil refineries and aircraft factories. It tied down enormous German resources in anti-aircraft defenses, including hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of artillery pieces that could otherwise have been deployed on the eastern or western fronts. It forced the Luftwaffe to concentrate fighters for homeland defense rather than supporting ground operations. And it had a cumulative effect on German civilian morale and the broader war economy. If Me-262s had made bombing Germany prohibitively expensive in terms of aircrew and aircraft losses, the Allies would have faced some difficult strategic choices. One possibility is that the Allies would have shifted their bombing strategy dramatically. Instead of daylight precision bombing of industrial targets deep in Germany, they might have focused more on tactical bombing in support of ground operations, hitting targets in occupied France, the Low Countries, and Italy, where jet fighters would be less concentrated. They might have increased their reliance on night bombing, where the speed advantage of jets would be less decisive, though British night raids were already quite effective without prompting such a shift. The Allies might also have prioritized destruction of jet fuel production facilities and airfields where Me-262s were based, accepting heavy losses in order to destroy the jet threat at its source. But here's where the analysis gets complicated, because we have to consider not just the tactical impact of Me-262s, but also the broader strategic and industrial realities of the war. Germany's fundamental problem was not primarily technological, but rather economic and industrial. By 1942, Germany was already fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior combined industrial capacity. The Soviet Union alone was outproducing Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. When you add American industrial might to the equation, the disparity becomes overwhelming. The United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during World War II compared to Germany's roughly 120,000. Even if Me-262s achieved a favorable kill ratio against Allied aircraft, say 5-1 or even 10-1, the Allies could afford those losses while Germany could not afford to lose experienced jet pilots. This leads us to a crucial constraint that would have limited the impact of earlier jet deployment: pilot training and fuel availability. By 1943, and certainly by 1944, Germany was experiencing critical shortages of both aviation fuel and experienced pilots. Training a pilot to fly a jet aircraft effectively was not simply a matter of putting him in the cockpit. Jets handled differently than piston-engine planes, with different acceleration characteristics, higher stall speeds, and engines that required careful management to avoid flameouts or mechanical failure. The Me-262's Jumo 04 engines were notoriously unreliable, with a service life of only about 25 hours before requiring complete overhaul or replacement. This meant that even if Germany produced thousands of Me-262s, keeping them operational would require enormous resources in terms of spare parts, maintenance personnel, and specialized facilities. The fuel situation was even more dire. Jet engines consumed fuel voraciously, and Germany's synthetic fuel production was already under severe strain by 1943. The Allied bombing campaign specifically targeted oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, and these attacks were devastatingly effective. By mid-1944, Germany's fuel production had collapsed to a fraction of its earlier levels. In our alternate timeline, where Me-262s are operational earlier and in greater numbers, they would accelerate German fuel consumption precisely when fuel was becoming critically scarce. This creates a paradox. The very weapon system designed to stop Allied bombing would require resources that Allied bombing was destroying. Germany would face an impossible choice between fueling jets to defend the homeland and fueling tanks and trucks to support ground operations on the eastern and western fronts. Let's also consider the industrial implications of prioritizing jet production earlier in the war. The Me-262 was a complex aircraft requiring specialized materials and manufacturing processes. Producing it in large numbers would necessitate diverting resources from other aircraft programs, including the Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters that formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe. These piston-engine fighters were effective, relatively easy to produce, and well-suited for ground attack and tactical support roles. By shifting to jet production earlier, Germany might actually reduce its overall fighter availability in the short term, creating a dangerous gap in capability. There's also the question of strategic materials. The Me-262 required significant quantities of high-grade steel alloys and other materials that were increasingly difficult for Germany to obtain as the war progressed and supply lines from occupied territories were cut. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects of this counterfactual is the question of how Adolf Hitler's personal interference affected the Me-262 program. Historically, Hitler became fixated on using the Me-262 as a high-speed bomber rather than a pure fighter. He believed that what Germany needed was a fast bomber that could strike Allied invasion forces, not another defensive fighter. This led to the development of bomber variants of the Me-262 and diverted resources and attention from fighter production. Hitler's interference is often cited as one of the key reasons the Me-262 arrived too late to affect the war's outcome. In our alternate scenario, we have to decide: does Hitler still interfere, or does earlier development of the program somehow insulate it from his meddling? If Hitler still demands bomber variants, then much of the potential advantage of earlier deployment is squandered. If somehow the Luftwaffe leadership manages to convince Hitler of the fighter's paramount importance, then the impact could be more significant. There's also the question of Allied countermeasures. The Allies were not static opponents. They adapted constantly to new German tactics and technologies. If Me-262s had appeared in significant numbers in 1942 or 1943, the Allies would have devoted enormous resources to countering them. This might have accelerated Allied jet development, bringing the Gloucester Meteor and P-80 Shooting Star into service earlier. The Allies might have developed specific tactics for dealing with jets, such as standing patrols over known jet bases to catch Me-262s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, when their speed advantage was negated. Indeed, this is exactly what Allied fighters did historically, once Me-262s appeared. They learned to patrol jet airfields and attack the jets when they were most vulnerable. The more successful Me-262s were operationally, the more urgently the Allies would have worked on countermeasures. Let's examine some specific historical moments and consider how they might have played out differently with earlier jet deployment. Take Operation Point Blank, the combined bomber offensive against German aircraft production facilities in late 1943 and early 1944. This campaign was designed to achieve air superiority in preparation for D-Day by destroying Germany's ability to produce fighters and by forcing the Luftwaffe into battles of attrition it could not win. With Me-262s available in substantial numbers, these deep penetration raids would have been far more costly. Bomber losses might have reached unsustainable levels, potentially forcing the Allies to delay or reconsider the invasion of France. However, it's crucial to note that achieving air superiority was only one component of D-Day preparations. The invasion depended on a vast array of factors including landing craft production, troop training, supply stockpiling, and favorable weather windows. Even if air superiority was delayed, the invasion itself might still have proceeded, albeit with greater risk and potentially higher casualties. Consider also the impact on the Eastern Front. While we tend to focus on the air war over Germany, the Luftwaffe was also heavily committed to supporting ground operations in the East. Could Me-262s have been effectively used on the Eastern Front? The answer is complicated. The Eastern Front was characterized by vast distances, primitive airfields, and a focus on ground attack missions rather than air-to-air combat. The Me-262's high speed and heavy armament actually made it less suitable for close air support than slower, more maneuverable piston-engine aircraft. Moreover, deploying Me-262s to rough forward airfields in Russia would have been logistically nightmarish given the aircraft's maintenance requirements and delicate engines. The Soviets, for their part, were producing aircraft in enormous quantities but were generally not as technically advanced as Western designs. Soviet fighters like the Yak-9 or La-5 would have been easy prey for Me-262s, but the question is whether this would have materially affected the ground war, where Soviet numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and infantry was the decisive factor. We should also consider the broader technological race of World War II. The appearance of effective German jets in 1942 or 1943 would have sent shockwaves through Allied military establishments. It would have accelerated not just Allied jet development, but potentially also work on other advanced technologies. Radar-equipped night fighters, early air-to-air missiles, improved anti-aircraft artillery, and even early surface-to-air missiles might have been rushed into development and deployment. The technological competition would have intensified dramatically. In this sense, earlier German jets might have accelerated the overall pace of aviation technology advancement, potentially bringing us closer to the jet age of the 1950s, but within the context of World War II. There's another dimension to consider: the production bottlenecks and industrial capacity questions. Even if Germany had recognized the importance of jets earlier and prioritized their development, could German industry actually have produced them in sufficient numbers to make a strategic difference? Germany's industrial capacity was impressive, but was increasingly strained by 1942 and 1943. The economy was not fully mobilized for total war until relatively late, and even then, it faced shortages of raw materials, labor, and energy. Producing thousands of Me-262s would have required building new factories or converting existing ones, training workers in new techniques, securing supply chains for specialized components, and doing all of this while under constant Allied bombing. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, worked miracles in increasing production of conventional weapons despite the bombing. But adding a complex new aircraft program to the mix would have been an immense challenge. Let's talk about the human factor, which is often overlooked in these technical discussions. Even with superior aircraft, victory in aerial combat depends on pilot skill, tactical doctrine, and morale. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was already losing its most experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. Training new pilots takes time, and training them to exploit the full potential of a revolutionary new aircraft takes even longer. In contrast, the Allies had robust pilot training programs that produced well-trained aviators in large numbers. American and British pilots might initially have been outmatched by Me-262s, but they would have learned and adapted. The Allies also had the advantage of being able to rotate experienced pilots out of combat zones to serve as instructors, spreading tactical knowledge throughout their air forces. Germany, always on the defensive after 1943, could not afford to pull its best pilots out of combat for training duties. There's also the question of strategic focus and opportunity cost. Every resource devoted to jet fighters was a resource not available for other purposes. Germany might have been better served by focusing on other technologies or strategies. For instance, what if the resources devoted to jet development had instead gone to submarine technology? The German U-boat campaign came close to strangling Britain's supply lines in 1942 and 1943. Advanced submarines with schnorkel systems, better torpedoes, and improved detection equipment might have been more strategically valuable than jet fighters. Or consider the V-2 rocket program, which consumed enormous resources but had minimal military impact. If those resources had gone to conventional weapons production, might Germany have been better off? The point is that technological advancement in one area necessarily means accepting limitations in others, and it's not always clear which investments yield the best strategic returns. Now, let's examine the most optimistic scenario for Germany. Me-262s enter service in mid-1942 in substantial numbers. Say 500 aircraft by the end of that year, and 2,000 by the end of 1943. German pilots are well trained, the engines are reliable enough for consistent operations, fuel is somehow available in sufficient quantities, and the aircraft are used purely as interceptors defending against Allied bombers. What's the maximum impact this could have? Allied bomber losses increase dramatically, perhaps doubling or tripling. The combined bomber offensive is set back by 6 months to a year. D-Day might be delayed from June 1944 to late 1944, or even early 1945. German industrial production benefits from reduced bombing damage. But here's the critical question: does any of this change the fundamental strategic situation? Germany is still fighting a two-front war against enemies with overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority. The Soviet Union is still grinding forward on the Eastern Front, where air power, while important, is not the decisive factor. The United States is still mobilizing its vast industrial base to produce overwhelming quantities of weapons. The atomic bomb is still being developed and will be ready by mid-1945 regardless of the air war in Europe. This brings us to perhaps the most sobering conclusion. Even in the most favorable scenario for German jet deployment, it's difficult to construct a plausible path to German victory, or even a negotiated peace. The best-case scenario for Germany is that the war is prolonged, that Allied casualties are higher, and that the final defeat is delayed. But defeat still comes. The industrial disparity is simply too great, the strategic situation too unfavorable, and Germany's resource constraints too severe. Jets might have been a tactical game changer, but they could not overcome strategic realities. Germany was attempting to fight the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States simultaneously, and no single weapon system, however advanced, could compensate for such odds. However, there is one scenario worth considering where earlier jets might have had truly significant strategic implications. If they had affected the timing and nature of Germany's ultimate defeat, they could have influenced the post-war political landscape. If the war in Europe had been prolonged into late 1945, or even 1946, this would have had profound consequences. The atomic bomb would almost certainly have been used against Germany as well as Japan. The Soviet advance into Central Europe might have gone even further west, with Stalin's armies potentially reaching the Rhine or even beyond. The political division of post-war Europe could have looked very different. The human cost would have been catastrophic, with millions more deaths from continued combat, from Nazi atrocities including the Holocaust continuing for longer, and from potential atomic bombing of German cities. In this sense, the very failure of the Me-262 program to achieve earlier deployment might paradoxically have been fortunate in that it allowed the war to end sooner, even though it ended in Germany's total defeat. We must also consider the counterfactual from the Allied perspective. If Me-262s had posed a more serious threat earlier in the war, would the Allies have pursued different strategic options? One possibility is an earlier invasion of France. If the bomber offensive was being stymied by jets, the Allies might have concluded that they needed to establish air bases in France to support shorter-range tactical missions and to threaten German jet bases more directly. This could have led to an invasion attempt in 1943 rather than 1944, though such an invasion would have been far more risky given that many of the specialized landing craft and air superiority conditions necessary for D-Day's success were not yet available in 1943. Alternatively, the Allies might have shifted more resources to the Mediterranean theater, seeking to knock Italy out of the war earlier and then advancing into southern Germany through Austria, bypassing the jet-defended skies over northern Germany. Another fascinating aspect to consider is how earlier German jet success might have affected Allied strategic bombing doctrine in the post-war period. The entire concept of strategic bombing was controversial even during World War II, with critics arguing that it was less effective and more costly than proponents claimed. If German jets had dramatically demonstrated the vulnerability of heavy bombers, this might have accelerated the development of long-range jet bombers and the tactics of high-altitude nuclear bombing that dominated early Cold War strategy. Conversely, it might have led to greater emphasis on ground-launched ballistic missiles as delivery systems for strategic weapons, advancing us toward an ICBM-dominated world earlier than historically occurred. Let's also examine the specific technical and tactical challenges of jet operations that would have limited even an earlier Me-262 deployment. Jets of the 1940s were primitive by modern standards, with poor acceleration, high fuel consumption, and engines prone to flameout if the throttle was moved too quickly. The Me-262 had a particularly nasty characteristic. Its engines took several seconds to spool up from idle to full power, meaning pilots had to anticipate power needs well in advance. In combat, this could be fatal. Additionally, the Me-262's high-wing loading and lack of powered controls made it heavy and unresponsive at low speeds. During takeoff and landing, when it was flying slowly, it was extremely vulnerable. Allied pilots quickly learned that the best time to attack Me-262S was during these vulnerable phases. If Me-262S had been operational earlier in greater numbers, Allied fighters would have simply intensified their patrols around known jet bases, potentially negating much of the jet advantage. There's also the question of tactical employment. How should jets best be used? Historically, Me-262s were employed in various roles: as pure interceptors against bomber formations, as fighter bombers, and even as reconnaissance aircraft. Each role required different tactics and had different effectiveness. As interceptors, Me-262s were devastating but also limited. Their high speed made them poor dogfighters against conventional fighters. They had to use hit-and-run tactics, slashing through bomber formations and then extending away before escort fighters could engage. This required excellent planning, timing, and execution. It also meant that each Me-262 could typically only make 1 or 2 attack runs per sortie. Against the massive formations of hundreds of bombers that the Allies employed, even a few dozen Me-262s, while deadly, might not be enough to break up a raid. German pilots developed tactics like forming up in large groups to concentrate their firepower, but this took time and fuel and made them more vulnerable to interception. Consider also the weather factor, which played a huge role in the air war over Europe. Northern Europe is often cloudy, rainy, and subject to poor visibility. The Allied bombing campaign was frequently constrained by weather, with many planned missions scrubbed due to poor conditions. But jets were even more weather-sensitive than piston-engine aircraft. The early jet engines were prone to problems in cold, wet conditions. Ice could form in the intakes, and water ingestion could cause flameouts. The Me-262's high landing speed meant it needed long runways, and wet or icy runways were particularly hazardous. In the brutal winter of 1944-45, historical Me-262 operations were often grounded by weather. In our alternate timeline, similar weather constraints would apply, limiting the effectiveness of jets during portions of the year when they might otherwise have been most needed. We should also address the elephant in the room: Germany's overall strategic situation and decision-making. Even if jets had been available earlier, would German leadership have used them effectively? The historical record shows repeated instances of strategic incompetence, from Hitler's interference in military decisions to the rivalry and dysfunction between different branches of the German armed forces. The Luftwaffe was often at odds with the army, and both clashed with the SS and the Nazi Party apparatus. Resources were wasted on prestige projects that had little military value. Intelligence was poor, with German leadership often operating on faulty assumptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. In this context, even a technological advantage like early jets might have been squandered through misuse, over-optimistic planning, or failure to integrate them properly into broader defensive strategy. Let's consider one final scenario that brings together many of these threads: the defense of Germany against the D-Day invasion. In actual history, the Luftwaffe was almost entirely absent from the skies over Normandy on June 6, 1944. Allied air superiority was so complete that German ground forces operated under constant threat of air attack. Now, imagine if Germany had 1,000 operational Me-262s in June 1944. Could they have contested the invasion? The answer is complex. Jets would have been effective against Allied bombers and ground attack aircraft, potentially inflicting heavy losses. However, jets were less suitable for close air support of ground troops, which is what German forces in Normandy desperately needed. The Me-262's high speed made precision attacks on small tactical targets difficult. Meanwhile, Allied escort fighters, while individually outmatched, would have been present in overwhelming numbers. The logistical situation would also have been problematic. Maintaining jets in the field, away from specialized facilities, would have been extremely difficult. Most likely, Me-262s would have inflicted higher casualties on Allied air forces, but would not have fundamentally changed the outcome of the invasion, which depended more on naval power, ground forces, and logistics than on air superiority alone. So, where does this leave us in answering our central question? If Germany had developed and deployed jet fighters earlier, say by 1942 or early 1943, would it have changed the outcome of World War II? The answer, after this deep examination, appears to be no, but with important caveats. Earlier jets would have made the Allied bombing campaign more costly and less effective. They might have delayed certain Allied operations, including possibly the D-Day invasion. They would have forced the Allies to adapt their tactics and accelerate their own technological development. The air war would have been more evenly matched, and Allied aircrew casualties would have been significantly higher. But ultimately, the fundamental strategic realities of the war would not have changed. Germany was fighting enemies with far greater industrial capacity, larger populations, and more abundant natural resources. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east regardless of air power considerations. American industrial might was mobilizing to produce weapons in quantities that Germany simply could not match. The Me-262, for all its revolutionary technology, could not overcome these massive disadvantages. The story of the Me-262 is ultimately a story about the limits of technological advantage in warfare. Technology matters, certainly, but it exists within a broader context of strategy, resources, industrial capacity, and human factors. Germany's jets represented a quantum leap in aviation technology, but that leap came too late, in too small numbers, and in circumstances where no technological advantage could compensate for strategic overreach and resource exhaustion. The counterfactual we've explored reveals that even under optimal conditions, with earlier deployment and better management, jets would have been a tactical advantage but not a strategic game-changer. They might have prolonged the war, increased its cost in blood and treasure, but they could not have won it for Germany. This sobering conclusion serves as a reminder that wars are not won by wonder weapons alone, but by the complex interplay of strategy, economics, politics, industry, and human will. The Me-262 was a remarkable aircraft, a glimpse of the future that arrived too late to save the regime that created it. And even arriving earlier, it would have been insufficient to alter the trajectory of history.